I'm Susan Flory, and this is The Big Middle, a podcast about all things midlife, being healthy older for much longer in a world fixated on youth. This is our second look at the low-carb, high-fat lifestyle being adopted by so many of us over 50s these days. Those of us who've examined the science behind it after years of calorie counting deprivation and disordered eating are finding it all makes sense. We are sharper on it, our cravings are gone, but there's no end of confusion about how to get started on low-carb, high-fat eating and how to keep it going for life, not just a month or two. Distinguished South African Professor Tim Noakes, we spoke to him last time out. He is evangelical about cutting the carbage and boosting the good fats, and he's here with us again to tell us what's what and why. First question, how does it differ from paleo?
Very little. They're all very similar, and the key is to reduce the carbohydrates so that because carbohydrates are the problem for those of us with insulin resistance. We can't metabolize carbohydrates, and every time we take in carbohydrate, we over-secrete insulin, and that's the hormone that seems to cause all the problems.
And do you think most of us who have extra fat hanging off our bodies are insulin resistant?
Yeah, not everyone who's overweight or obese is insulin resistant, but the vast majority are. But it's very important to remember, too, that many thin people are also insulin resistant, and probably 20 or 30% of the total group of people who are insulin resistant are in fact lean.
But when you go to your family doctor, you don't get the test. You seldom get an overnight fasting insulin.
No, that's correct. And the same if you go to a dietitian. And they blame us. They say you've got one size fits all, but they give a one size fits all diet, and they don't even consider your metabolic profile when they provide that diet.
So first thing, you get your blood glucose tested and your fasting insulin, your overnight fasting insulin.
Yeah, and your glycated hemoglobin, HbA1c. That's a real key, because you're quite correct. Early on, the first abnormality is insulin, then the second abnormality is glucose. But once the glucose is elevated for any length of time, your glycated hemoglobin value goes up. And the reason is that glucose in the bloodstream binds to proteins, and it binds to the most popular protein in the blood, which is hemoglobin. And the more glucose is in the bloodstream, the more it binds to hemoglobin. And a value of 4.5% is fantastic. You don't have to worry.
But if you're at 5?
If you're at 5, you're fine. You're still fine. But 5.5 is where I diagnose diabetes.
Wow, but that's low. Most mainstream doctors don't diagnose it at 5.
But if you took those 5.5s, I'd guess 50, 60, 70% will be already diabetic on proper testing. But we wait till they get to 6.5. We give them another 10 years before we start acting. Whereas if we took everyone when the hemoglobin is 5.5 and said, okay, now you must reduce your carbs and keep on a low-carb diet, they'd never develop type 2 diabetes. And the type 2 diabetes is completely, utterly preventable.
Yeah.
By proper screening and action, low-carbohydrate diet.
And that's a 3-month view of your blood glucose levels.
That's correct. Yeah, the glycated hemoglobin looks back to what happened in the previous 3 months.
So go to your GP, get that test, and then read your books and figure it all out and go on the internet and learn about fasting. So just getting back to the particulars of your way of eating, low-carb, high-fat, how does it differ from Atkins?
I think not at all. I think that the only thing is we might go a little bit lower in carbohydrates than Atkins did.
What are you thinking, 20 grams, 25 grams?
I go down to 25 grams, and many people say you should go down to naught.
And what if you're up to 50 or 70, let's say?
That generally it'll be fine, but you need to monitor your blood values, but particularly your insulin and glucose. The problem is once you're diabetic, your glucose will always be elevated. However hard you try, you can take quite a lot of medication. There'll still be a group who are even on 25 grams, like myself. My glucose is still a bit elevated in the mornings, but that doesn't worry me because my insulin is low. So we actually need to focus on insulin. But we don't have the data yet to say what should your 24-hour insulin secretion be. That is the key. And
can it vary? Can it be up and down depending on your hormones?
That's really interesting.
Other hormones?
No, it could be. It would interact with diet and hormones and sleep patterns. But it's never been studied because insulin is not easy to measure. It was only first measured in the late 1960s. And it's slowly there are being systems available where you can do it yourself. But they're not yet mainstream. But I think in 5 years' time, it's as easy to measure glucose. You'll be able to measure insulin just as easily.
And now that people are becoming more aware of this way of eating and reading all the success stories and looking at the science and going, well, I'm going to try that because the conventional diet advice isn't working.
Yeah.
So hopefully they'll be able to get their own medical tests and follow the biomarkers and make their own decisions about their health.
Yeah, the easiest thing to do is just buy yourself a glucometer which measures your blood glucose, and buy yourself 100 sticks, and that'll put you back maybe £100 max, absolute maximum. And you can do your own diagnostic tests. All you do is you just measure your glucose 3 times a day, particularly after meals, hour or two after meals. And you'll soon see that when you eat your carbohydrates, your glucose shoots up above 8, 10, 12 millimoles per liter. And that's not good. You want to keep it down below 7 most of the time, preferably below 6.
So do that and get the Banting Pocket Guide, which is your latest book.
That's right, yeah.
Just to see what you can be eating and how it all hangs together, the science. And I'm curious about the name, because here in South Africa it is known as Banting. Relaxed version of ketogenic is how I probably wrongly defined it, because it's not relaxed, it's even more restrictive from what you're telling me, because ketogenic is 20 grams of carbs a day.
That's correct, or even less. And also it's restricted in protein, I think. So I'm not sure that people get it. Having studied my own ketones for 7 years, in fact, I started studying it when I was 28 or 29. We did clinical trials on myself. So
you're going more the Atkins way as opposed to the keto way, where it's moderate protein. You're putting more protein, fewer
even
vegetables.
Then I can't get my ketones up very high, even if I don't eat any carbohydrates.
But you're a fat burner now.
I think you adapt to ketone production, and so it may for the first year have high ketones, but in time it comes right down.
But you know by the way that you fuel yourself that you are burning fat.
Yeah, I'm burning fat all the time. That's right, yeah.
And your ketones just might not reflect that.
Yeah, exactly. They may not be up. They do go up at times and they come down at other times.
So it's not the Canadian Banting, Sir Frederick, co-discoverer of insulin, because that's what's confusing.
Yeah, it's William Banting, the undertaker in London, who was the first person to be put on this diet. He tried everything. He tried the calories in, calories out. He'd bought a rowing skiff and rowed up and down the Thames hours a day. And he said, I got very calloused hands and got very hungry.
And he stayed fat.
And I got very strong, but I was still fat. But when he went on the low-carb diet, he had an amazing result. And that is the first diet book, the very first diet book in history.
An undertaker.
Yeah.
From the UK.
Exactly right.
In 1862. Wild.
Yeah. Well, the diet was prescribed for him by Dr. William Harvey. And Harvey had just been to Paris, and he'd heard Claude Bernard, the very famous physiologist, speak. He was the first guy to recognize that glucose is produced by the liver. And that was his great discovery. And Harvey went to listen to this lecture, and somehow he said glucose in the liver, glucose diabetic, glucose in the urine, diabetes, obesity, diabetes, something to do with carbohydrates. And he was the first test was on Banting, and it worked on Banting. But
and so
really
the name stuck. Are you the one who gave this way of eating that descriptive?
No,
as
really.
Opposed to ketogenic?
It's interesting how the Banting name came to South Africa, because we wrote a book called The Real Meal Revolution, which we wrote in 5 weeks. Normally I take 5 years to write a book.
Pretty fat book to have written in 5 weeks.
That's right. And the senior author who did all the real work, I just added a bit of the science. The night before we sent the book off for a review, he changed low-carb, high-fat, LCHF, for Banting. He said, no, LCHF, no one wants to use that term. So he changed the word to Banting, and that was a brilliant stroke.
But with Atkins, with Banting, with ketogenic, the upsum is cut the carbs, cut the sugar.
Yeah, exactly.
And go forth and be happier.
Exactly.
Be less hungry all your life.
And I think people want to claim, I developed the low keto or whatever diets. They're all pretty much the same.
Okay, so some rapid fire questions about, as we said, this show's all about the fundamentals of low carb, high fat. I'm going to call it LCHF, sticks for me. Any calorie counting or measuring and weighing of things on this?
That's a great question. It's because 10% of people put on weight on this diet, particularly women who, when they're given the free rein to eat, then they do eat.
Oh, I know this.
Yeah.
Yep. You think, oh, nuts. And you don't just have a few.
Yeah.
You go for the whole bowl.
So whereas men seem to lose weight more easily on this diet, it's probably because they've never eaten restrained, and they've never been restrained eaters. And now what happens is they've always eaten too much anyway.
Oh, so this just reins them in a bit.
Yeah, exactly, because now they get less hungry, and so it works. But if you're a female and you put on weight on the diet, then unfortunately you have to count calories. And you have to be careful about how much fat you eat. And I would advise those people to push up the protein to 40% of calories.
Okay.
So eat a higher protein diet. Because many people are satiated by protein. I mean, there's a whole unit at Sydney University which tells us it's got nothing to do with fat. It's protein which causes satiety. But they also promote carbohydrates and sugar, so they have another agenda.
So you think they're only getting a morsel of the message, right?
I think they've got another agenda. Because for me, if I go out and eat lean meat, I have to come home and eat fat before I'm satiated.
But you're talking avocado, olive oil, coconut.
And cheese,
Yeah, and cheese.
Yeah.
Love the cheese. And do you eat double cream yogurt?
I do, absolutely. And if triple cream, if you can make it.
And in coffee in the morning, do you have cream?
Cream. Yeah, I'm having a cappuccino now, but that's the only milk I will drink.
I mean, I do intermittent fasting, and I'm not any leaner, but I'm a lot sharper, and I don't get hungry, so the cravings gone. So I'm sticking with it and hoping that dividend will eventually be less meaty hips. But I also have the thyroid thing, which we talked about in the first time we sat down. So estrogenic women, menopausal women, what's the ratio for them?
You make a very good point that I don't think that the weight loss is not the issue. It's getting your insulin down. That's the key. And so, because they're separate things, the brain determines how many calories you eat. It also determines how much energy you expend. And that is influenced by insulin, leptin, and ghrelin, all those things. And interestingly, we now know that triglycerides impact. And the key to this diet, one of the keys, is it drops your triglyceride levels dramatically. And that probably, it's been discovered that triglycerides block the action of leptin in the brain. And leptin inhibits your hunger, so it satiates you. So if you've got high triglycerides, you can be secreting all the leptin you like, you'll still be hungry.
And triglycerides is fat in the blood.
It's fat in the blood, that's correct. And it's produced in the liver in response to carbohydrates in the diet. And as soon as you cut the carbohydrates, your triglycerides drop dramatically. And you lose this fatty liver, which is another big component. And the carbohydrate diets, you never get that effect. And that's why your hunger remains, we think, because your triglycerides remain high. Even though you're eating fewer calories, you're still hungry because of that.
And it's why those TV shows, I mean, we've all seen the after stories of the guy who lost 700 pounds and became a mere shadow of himself. And then 2 minutes later, when he goes back to the conventional way of eating, he packs it all back on.
Well, my great friend is AJ van der Walt, who lost 130 kilos. He started at 260. He's down to 130. He's still a big guy. But he's now training to run the Ironman, to do the Ironman triathlon.
Wow.
And he swims, cycles, and runs every day.
He smiles through every day.
Exactly. And he's still heavy, but this guy's, he's healthy.
So his physical health and his mental outlook is 100%
And he's so positive about life, whereas he was, I guess he was pretty suicidal at 260 kilos.
Oh, you couldn't move, could you? You could barely get off your bed.
Exactly.
Now, some call low-carb, high-fat eating an extreme way of fueling your body. Is it, do you think?
Well, it's really interesting. But if you go back to 1960, the American diet was 45% fat and 35% carbohydrate, i.e. it was a high-fat diet. Now, it's true that on this low-carb diet, you probably will be eating 50% fat and 20% or 10% carbohydrate. So it's a move away from it, but the average diet in 1960s in the United States was a high-fat diet.
And as you said in the last podcast when we talked about this, when you saw the picture of the Beatles in the 60s, there was no one fat in the crowd.
Exactly. And my point is, as long as you keep the fat above 45% and carbs below 40% for life, you're probably okay. But the problem is now we've gone above 40% and we've cut the fat down below 45%, and we do it from the day of birth. And that means that every generation is also getting fatter, because there's a huge effect, an epigenetic effect about what your mother ate during her pregnancy. And the more carbs she ate, the more likely it is you're going to be carb dependent and insulin resistant. So we're passing it from generation to generation. And the tragedy is, as I said, that because I matriculated in 1966, everyone was lean, and that's what's normal for me. And when I go around in South Africa, I'm appalled, because I know what humans are meant to look like, and almost no one looks like that anymore. But if you're born 20 years ago, you don't know.
And it's all the processed food full of hydrogenated fats and sugar.
Absolutely. And flour. Those are the three killers.
But even with the conventional guidelines, which I followed religiously, I really thought, wow, I've got amazing willpower. I'm having my fruit, I'm having my half cup of oatmeal. Now I don't eat porridge, low carb, high fat. Now I say no almost all the time to the beautiful sweet potato on the plate. I occasionally still crave that because you're inundated with the message that these are superfoods and they're nutrient dense and you must have them, but you don't think that way at all anymore.
Not at all. Zoe Harcom, who we discussed, she's
a PhD.
She's a PhD she did
London
her MS
based
in Cambridge, and she's just the best statistician and dietitian in the world by a long way. And she was part of my team defending me
your
in
Twitter
my trial.
yeah.
And she looked at Dr. Michael Greger's book, Live Longer by Eating a Vegan Diet. And she looked at what he said, a week's food, and it was totally deficient in B12 and choline and a couple other things. And so she said that. She said, well, you're not going to live very long on this diet.
You drag yourself around.
Because it's deficient in all these things.
But that's the other thing. I mean, the importance of B12.
Yeah.
A lot of the mainstream medical community, they just naysay, your level is only 200, and it's what? You're deficient in Japan at 500.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the low border for the guideline in the UK is 209.
That's right.
And as long as you're hugging that low border, you're all right.
Yeah.
And you could be having, toe pain and be dragging yourself around, having brain fog nonstop. How do people become insulin resistant so early in life and it lasts so long?
Yeah. So I think all humans are insulin resistant. I think, the majority, let me rephrase that. Our evolution developed people who are insulin resistant. There may be some population like the Catawans, but there are about 2,700 Catawans who are very lean, they eat a very high carbohydrate diet, and they're insulin sensitive. But they're almost a standout population. Even the Chinese and the Japanese who are now putting on weight on the diet, and the Indians eating a low-fat diet are becoming diabetic and putting on weight.
But is that because they've adopted this North American lifestyle? All of the, and it's Coca-Cola and McDonald's and...
So the Indians were always vegetarian, but they didn't have diabetes to the extent that they now have it. So something's changed. But the absence of meat was, in my view, the problem. But let's return to your question. If you're eating a carnivorous diet, which humans started eating 3 to 4 million years ago, you have to be insulin resistant because you need to save the glucose, some glucose for the brain. And you just burn the rest, you burn fat. So insulin resistance is beneficial, particularly if you are exposed to some honey and fruit for 2 months of the year. You can put on fat and maybe that'll help you through the winter.
But your body is almost self-regulating on that sort of a regime.
Absolutely, because within 2 months you stop eating the carbs and you lose the weight again. What's happened today, we just eat carbs continuously so that you've got this no period after you've been hibernating or eating a lot of carbohydrate to put on the fat. We don't have that period where you change.
In the typical Western diet, if everyone's following the conventional guidelines and counting the calories, how many grams of carbs is the average person consuming? Is it in the hundreds?
300 to 500, yeah.
Seriously?
And if you're a world-class athlete, you're probably eating 600 to 700 grams a day.
But you're a sports scientist.
Yeah.
The athletes are in a sphere of their own, surely. I mean, because some athletes, they can manage on that. Their systems are not carb intolerant.
For a short time, you're quite right. But they can do it for 10 years and then they get problems. So the greatest Olympian of all time, Sir Stephen Redgrave, 5 Olympic gold medals, type 2 diabetic, currently ate a very high carbohydrate diet in training and so on. And he's the tip of the iceberg. But I know Dave Scott, one of my great friends is Dave Scott, who was the first Ironman triathlon. He won the first 6 Ironman triathlons. And he was vegan. He said, I would avoid fat, everything I could do. And he said, somehow I won those 6 races. He said, but there were moments when my mood wasn't great. And he overcame it because he didn't understand where these funny thoughts were coming from. He read my book 3 years ago and he converted.
The Real Meal Revolution.
He read The Real Meal and he converted. He said, oh my gosh. He said, I will never tell an athlete to eat a high carbohydrate diet. And he focuses a lot on fish and he's meticulous in his diet. But he says when he watches these young athletes, they can last for about 10 years on a high-carb diet, but then they collapse.
So the key to all of this is to eat a diet that keeps blood insulin and glucose concentrations low, because elevated insulin concentrations are linked to the long-term chronic diseases that the obesity, the type 2 adult, not even adult onset. I keep forgetting you can't say that anymore, to type 2 diabetes. But for type 1 diabetics, that is a completely different ballgame.
Not at all. It's exactly the same.
They don't create insulin.
They don't create insulin. They have to inject insulin, but they inject insulin in proportion to how much carbohydrate they eat. And the traditional way we treat them is we say it's your right to have carbohydrates, but you just have to inject to control the
to match what you're eating.
Exactly. The problem is they become insulin resistant because insulin makes you insulin resistant. And that's what happens with, I think perhaps we should have made this point. The more carbohydrates you eat, the more insulin you secrete, the more insulin resistant you become.
But if your pancreas is making no insulin at all, you're a type 1 diabetic,
But
how would you become insulin resistant?
You're injecting insulin.
You're over-injecting.
So the injecting is enough to make you insulin resistant. And so we want people who are type 1 diabetic to inject insulin once a day. If you're properly controlled, you should be injecting insulin once a day. You don't need more than one injection a day. Type 1 diabetics do not put on weight unless they inject insulin. And we know its main effect is to switch off fat metabolism and switch on carbohydrate metabolism. So the whole goal of the low-carb diet is to make you a fat burner.
So now you're veering more toward the Atkins plate as opposed to the keto plate, and you're definitely nowhere near the Mediterranean diet plate. So what can you eat?
Well, the Mediterranean diet's complete garbage. You know, there's one study, the PrettyMed study, that everyone quotes. It's complete garbage. It was a disaster. It's completely wrong. And everyone tells you, oh, you see, now we have final data. But when it gets analyzed, and Zoe Harcom is one of the people who've analyzed this data, it is rubbish.
So is it the agro-industrial complex that has put the wool over everyone's eyes with this, or
I
what?
think it was medicine. You see, medicine said, okay, the diet's wrong. The diet we've got, but we're not going to admit it's wrong. But let's shift to a diet which has got slightly more fat in it. That's the Mediterranean diet.
Right.
And here we've got this famous study published in the New England Journal showing that it works. Well, it was put in there because they wanted to make the shift.
So it's a nod to the low-carb, high-fat people, so it's just giving a morsel of fat in there. But just getting back to my question then, for anyone out there who's coming across that, what do you eat then? What can you eat with a Banting lifestyle?
Okay, so I eat fish, meat, dairy, and I eat lots of cheese, nuts, eggs, vegetables, and that's it.
Roasted nuts with salt on them?
Yeah, absolutely. Salt is needed. There's no evidence that salt is damaging to your health.
So do you think your body knows when you don't want something salty,
again,
you've had enough?
Salt is completely wrong. There's a lovely book called The Salt Fix in which the author goes and shows that there was no evidence that salt is toxic. And in fact, there are 2 or 3 studies and there's a meta-analysis published in the last 6 months showing that we got it all wrong. That if you are hypertensive, high blood pressure, and you have a high salt diet, yes, 50% will benefit by reducing. But if you're lean and you don't have high blood pressure, is only reducing salt actually makes you worse, makes you less healthy.
Okay, so fat, protein, fish, cheese, yogurt, all of that. Chicken with the skin on?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, you've got to look for fat. I mean, I look for fat, as humans always did. If you go back to England 10,000 years ago, what did England look like? It was under ice. And no one tells you that. And what about North America? Most of it was under ice 10,000 years ago. And there were people living there. What were they eating? Fruit and veg? Cereals and grains? No, they were eating mammoths.
They had to defrost it first.
Exactly. They were eating mammoths. And the Neanderthals went extinct when they ran out of elephants because
those were the fattest animals.
You had to hunt the fattest animals for various reasons because you can only eat 40% of your calories as protein. If you go to 50%, you will die in the long term because our bodies are built to provide enough but not too much. And we can detoxify 40% of our diet as protein. If it goes to 45%, we can't detoxify that protein. And so if you get lost in the desert and all you can eat is lean animals, you die because you die of this protein poisoning. And most antelope in Africa are lean except for the eland. And then you have the rhinoceros and the elephant and the hippopotamus, and that's what you have to hunt. And humans were such good hunters that they could eat those. And so, I mean, why do you think elephants have no natural enemies? They should have wiped out all of Africa, should just have been elephants. And they aren't. It never was. until we started protecting them. And then their numbers grew. Why? Because humans killed them out. We were the natural reason why elephants never dominated. Because we had to get the fattest animals.
Now, the good, fattest animal protein sources are, for you, fish, beef. Beef was demonized.
Yeah.
In conventional thinking, you're only allowed to have a morsel of steak once a month.
Well, it's ludicrous. I mean, there's no evidence for that. We like to eat grass-fed. You must eat grass-fed meat. That's the key.
But how do you ever know that it's grass-fed? Because there's not a lot of information on food labeling in the
You have to
supermarkets.
go to the butchers. You have to go to the specialist butcheries. You can't go to the supermarket. You can tell because the fat's yellow if it's grass-fed.
Now that's an interesting
Yeah.
tip. If
And
it's
if
white, stay away.
Then it's fed on corn, maize.
What if you can't afford anything but a farm-produced,
Well, then you
run-of-the-mill chicken?
Then you have the Noakes Foundation, which is our foundation, and you have the Eat Better South Africa campaign, and we're teaching people to eat on 30 Rand a day. And that already is too much because most South Africans, poor as live on 15 Rand a day, 15 Rand a day.
But this podcast's going global. What about
Yeah.
the rest of the world? Let's say...
The same applies. I mean, that we've got the poorest of the poor in this country who have got the same problems, and we're showing them how to eat on 15 Rand, which is $2 maximum. In fact, it's almost $1.
So where do
a
they
day.
get their protein source?
They get it from pilchards and eggs and milk.
Okay. So no variety for them.
No, there's no variety. But I mean, there's no variety in my diet. There's very little variety.
So what will you eat tonight and for the next 5 evenings? Because I know, like me, you do intermittent fasting. You eat
Yeah.
at dinner and then you
Yeah.
don't eat until a late
Yeah.
lunch.
Yeah.
But you have coffee with cream,
Yeah.
and that doesn't spike your insulin?
Well, the milk, I had milk here, so it will spike it a bit. But then I've been exercising, so
You're
that
a
will
fat
have
burner already.
Yeah. So what'll I eat? I'll
Yeah.
eat fish or meat, and that's it.
No vegetables at all.
Well, there'll
Bit of
be
kale?
a little bit of kale and a little bit of other things, but a bit of tomato and mushrooms, perhaps.
Yogurt chaser for your pudding.
Yeah. And occasionally my wife is kind enough to give me some berries.
What about dairy, which can be problematic for a lot of people?
Well, I was here last week with a German who's convinced that dairy is the devil, like sugar. And he sent me a whole lot of material. And it's clear that some people benefit by stopping dairy. The mechanism, I'm not sure about. I don't know what it is, but it's clear that they definitely do. And
But they react to the sugar, like you and I react to carbs.
That's correct.
Sugar, carbs equals...
Exactly. And there's a lot of sugar and carbohydrate in milk. And so drinking a glass of milk a day, that destroys you. That's probably 20 grams, maybe.
So that's your
even more.
load. You should
That's your
have
load.
cream in your coffee,
Exactly.
not
Yeah.
even full cream milk.
But there may well be something that is wrong with dairy for many people. And certainly the women who we found who put on weight on the diet, we just say cut dairy, and some of them get a dramatic result.
And back off the nuts for a bit too?
Cutting the dairy is enough to do it in some people. So all I'm saying is that I eat a lot of dairy and I couldn't live without it. But for many people, so I don't see the problems. The German colleague was very definitely milk intolerant. He had major issues with milk, so he'd researched it.
So you say some people put on weight, women especially,
Yeah.
10%.
Yeah.
You've looked at my food log. You saw how I was starving myself.
Yeah, exactly.
The poster girl for the conventional way of eating and counting calories and all the rest. And I still had fat on my body. What do I, as a post-menopausal woman who just wants to be healthy, what am I going to eat?
Okay, you eat once a day. That's the key. You fast for 16 to 24 hours a day. A lot of people tell you that is the key. Once you start fasting, it all fits into place.
What about that old thinking, though, that I grew up on when I was being told, no, you've got to keep your engine running. You've got to spike your metabolism every couple of hours or else it's just going to die.
Yeah.
It's going to hold on to every single calorie you give yourself.
No, well, that's not true. The reason why the dietitians tell us to eat 6 meals a day is because they're dealing with people who are sugar addicted. And as soon as you eat a low-fat diet, it's going to be full of sugar. It's highly processed. And you need to eat every 3 hours because you're addicted to the eating. So that's the question. I said, if you're eating every 3 hours, you're eating in an addictive pattern. Whereas I can eat every 24 hours. And that's because I'm not addicted anymore. I was a classic sugar addict. But now, once you cut the sugar out, and I want to make the point that it's all or nothing. You can't have a little bit of sugar. And you can't have a little bit of added...
Just a bit of ice cream
sweet.
after your steak?
No. If you
What about booze?
It's the same. It fits in the same category.
Is that pure sugar?
It is. You know, I was actually at a breakfast the other day, and they gave wine, and they saw me taste it, and I almost spat it out because I realized the reason I liked wine was because it was sweet. I never drank it for the alcohol. I drank it for the sweetness, and this was a very sweet wine. And then, because I have an aversion to sweetness.
Why did you taste it?
Because I just wanted to see what it tastes like. Yeah.
You just wanted to have that very physical reaction in front of everyone.
Exactly. I said, there's my addiction. I will drink that whole thing. I'll take it down in a gulp because it's sugar. Not because it's alcohol, because it's sugar. And it's sweet, and it's extremely sweet. And
what about popcorn?
Sure, that's a disaster.
Is it?
Yeah, no, that's a shocker.
I used to think, again, this is great. Did you see that in my food log? Yes, 3 cups of air-popped popcorn with Herbomare on it. And I would think, well, it's not a bag of chips or crisps or Doritos or anything.
Yeah. You know, the funny thing is, one of my great heroes is a guy called Ralph Paffenbarger. And Ralph Paffenbarger is known for coming from Harvard, from the Harvard School of Public Health, which has done a lot of bad in nutrition, but he was on the exercise side. And he was a great friend of mine. And he came and did his sabbatical, and he lived in our house, which is just up the road here. And he would eat this bloody popcorn every day because he had cardiac disease. And of course, he had to eat a low-fat diet. And
never touched butter, but here he was mainlining insulin.
And exactly right. And he died in cardiac failure. You know, and he was a guy who'd run many marathons, many more than I had. He'd run the 100-mile race. He'd run the 24-hour race. He was a real addict for exercise. We didn't understand it was the diet that killed him.
But I'm quite astonished that you're so against vegetables. I mean, surely to get the nutrients, the antioxidants, all of the goodness in what we've all come to learn.
But why do you need antioxidants if your body's not inflamed?
I don't know. Don't your cells need the things in blueberries and the things in kale and mixed greens?
The body produces all the antioxidants it needs. So you see, this is all mythology. Like my professor who got me onto the low-fat diet, he's a great wine expert. So he'll tell you, you've got to try red wine because it's got the antioxidants.
Resveratrol.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, and you see, here's a study. But it's garbage. That study was funded by the industry. And anyway, it's not long-term studies.
Well, you did take a little tiny side poke at Harvard, too.
Yeah.
And I know that the academic community there has come in for a lot of stick as being conflicted and funded by all of these other...
And they do all associational studies. Yeah. And then they write that it's causation. And they know it's not. They know it's not.
And then we read an article in the mainstream media and think, oh, that's the way to go.
Right. Meat causes cancer. Every week or every 3 weeks it comes out. Who funds Harvard? Harvard was funded by sugar in the 1950s. And they've been corrupt ever since. And it's too appalling. And these are guys who are considered the doyens of scientific research. And they're doing epidemiological research, which is meaningless.
Fundamentals now of low-carb, high-fat. What ratios are best? Carb, fat, protein. I know now, because we've talked, carb is 0 for you. You're leaning more and more. Cut the vegetables, cut everything. You can't be a vegan, you can't be a vegetarian on this diet. And get your own tipsy high from feeling good.
That's right.
Never reach for the wine glass.
So I like to say they're actually grams of carbohydrate, not percentages. And so it's between 0 and 200 grams of carbs a day. So if you're type 2 diabetic like myself, you want to be 25 grams or less. And then you can be completely normal.
And if you're insulin resistant, pre-diabetes?
Then I would say 50 to 100. Yeah. And the only people who can eat 200 grams a day are elite athletes playing for Manchester United, Manchester City, Liverpool, etc., who are burning a lot of energy every
Or those
day.
who are genetically predisposed. I mean, I do have that girlfriend I told you about, whip it thin, and she eats really well, but she has cravings. I mean, she grabs the macadamias. Every hour she seems to be filling her face, but she never packs on anyway.
Yeah, but she may be insulin resistant, and because she could be harming her health. You know, what's her HbA1c?
But she might just disappear if she gave up all the carbs. Because she eats a lot of carbs.
No, she would, but she would lose 5 kilograms, but she'd be healthier for it.
So her interior would be healthier.
Yeah, that's correct. You know, I had a medical doctor came up to me, a 36-year-old marathon runner, and he said, you know, Tim, I couldn't believe it. My HbA1c was 7.5, which means frank diabetes. And he said, I could never believe it. No one never thought about testing myself. Yeah, healthy.
Because he presented as completely healthy,
absolutely.
Lean running machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Are any sugary treats allowed
No.
when eating low-carb, high-fat?
No.
Tiny bowl of sorbet?
So, if you can control your sugar addiction, I think the main driver of obesity is sugar addiction. And it's not recognized. Why? Because the industry doesn't want us to notice that sugar is the problem. And that's what drives you to be addictive eating.
Historically, when did we start eating sugar?
The intake of sugar starts in Britain in the 1800s. But it really takes off in the 1900s.
And the obesity epidemic is lockstep with that?
No, because you have to get above some sort of sugar intake, and then the obesity epidemic takes off. It's rather closer linked to the total carbohydrate intake. But I still think the sugar is driving it. And so what I've learned in my journey is that I cannot take sugar because I would just go straight back to the addiction. And that's, I think, what people have. The people who do well on this diet get rid of the sugar addiction.
So for you, it's a physiological response.
Absolutely. I mean,
can't you control it, mind over matter?
No, not at all. Not at all. Absolutely not. So I told you about that wine. I would have drunk the whole glass of wine.
And asked for more.
And asked for more because it was the sweetness, it wasn't the alcohol.
So that's why we all get sloshed at the braai on the weekend.
Some people may be looking for the alcohol, some may be looking for the sugar. Yeah.
Picking up on something you said earlier, you said we should be eating once a day, and that's it. None of this snacking.
No, I didn't say don't snack. I think that it's difficult
to get... But that's eating.
It's difficult. Most of us need 2,000 calories if you're male, maybe 1,400, 1,500 if you're female. And
so you still believe in that unit of measurement, calorie?
Because you can't get fat unless you eat more calories than you need. That's the truth.
But you've looked at my food log.
Yeah.
So how would someone like me, who still doesn't eat a lot of calories, how would I be storing back fat and be thicker than normal when I've been doing a year and a half of low-carb, high-fat with very few falls off the wagon?
Well, the answer would be that the traditional answer would be your metabolic rate is now so low.
From a lifetime
of starvation.
So I have metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, so you've cut your metabolic rate way down.
How do I reverse this?
You probably can't. Rita Fento, who runs the Banting 7-Day Meal Plan Facebook page, eats 1,200 calories a day. But if she eats more, she'll put on weight.
But there's no way to get our metabolisms back on a steady keel?
You can exercise a lot and build up muscle, but that's not going to make
because muscle burns fat.
Yeah. So, the only time I was lean when I was insulin resistant, when I was running 2 hours a day. If I ran 2 hours a day, but why? Because I would burn off the carbs. So I was eating the carbs and just burning them out. But the minute I reduced my exercise to 1 hour a day, the weight came on again because now the excess carbohydrate was just being stored.
So I'm not eating this way then to reverse and get myself out of metabolic syndrome, but I'm eating this way for all of my organs to avoid chronic diseases.
Exactly right.
But I will never be lean because I've broken my metabolism from years of dieting.
That's right. I mean,
years of restricting calories, let's call it. You could,
technically, if you starved yourself, of course you could lose the weight, but then you'd be sick. And you don't want to do that. But fatness is not the measure. Weight is not the measure.
Optimal health.
Yeah, it's optimal health. Exactly right. And so the fat outside is actually not a problem. It's when the fat's in the liver that's the problem. So you can be perfectly healthy with a BMI, slightly elevated BMI, as long as you restricted the amount of fat that's in your liver.
And since we're talking fundamentals, best snacks to reach for at a social event?
Macadamia nuts, cheese.
So pack your own.
And biltong. And bacon. I mean, bacon's a great food.
But it's not part of everyone's social spread. So really, you need to start packing your own snacks. And just being diligent about that. Yeah,
and you start with your children. You send them to school with those foods. We wrote a book called Raising Superheroes. I think it's called Superfoods for Super Children in Britain. And there it's got all the options for feeding children. And the snacks, they're delicious.
So beef jerky for North Americans,
Absolutely.
Biltong here in South Africa,
Correct.
Cheese, coconut
avocado,
shavings?
Coconut, absolutely.
Bacon wrapped avocado.
Oof.
That's amazing.
That is. It is, yeah.
Okay. Well, you've given us a couple of success stories, heavyweights who've managed to bring their weight down and improve their biomarkers, their health markers. Thank you so much, Professor Tim Noakes, for coming on to the Big Middle twice. Really appreciate it. And I'll put some links up on my website to all of your websites.
Fantastic.
And all of your output of, well, not every paper, because what are there, 750?
I think that
if not
includes
more.
Everything, chapters and books and so on, yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan. It's been a great privilege to chat to you.
Professor Tim Noakes, celebrated South African sports scientist, controversial campaigner for eating low-carb, high-fat, Relevant information is found right here on The Big Middle. Inspirational interviews about midlife every other week. I'm Susan Flory, and we'll see you next time.